we need good policies and practices of governments, companies, investors, and a range of national and international institutions and stakeholders. They need to play an important role to maximize positive impact while minimize potential harms. So what can they do and how can they do? So now the floor is yours, Yigu.
Thank you, Claire. So I'll share my screen first. You can see my screen, right? Great.
Yes.
Good evening, everyone. So thank you for inviting me here to speak at this seminar, and it's really my pleasure to be here to join this discussion. So first I'll give you a snapshot of impact investing and also sustainable investing in China in a post-COVID era. So first I will talk a little bit about sustainable investing in China, and then we'll focus on impact investing. So maybe first I'll just give you a very brief introduction of who we are. So CSIF was initiated by Narada Foundation and was jointly founded by 17 Chinese top foundations and other organizations as a nonprofit organization in 2014. So our goal is to promote the idea of using business and capital as a force for good to solve more social and environmental problems. And earlier this year, we launched this new initiative called China Impact Investing Network, which is pretty much like GIN, if you know the Global Impact Investing Network. So our goal or our mission is to establish industry standards, build critical industry infrastructure, and also help to accelerate the scale and effectiveness of impact investing here in China. So we do that via education, empowerment, and also facilitate more exchanges. So about sustainable investing in China, first, I think maybe we need to be on the same page of what sustainable investing is here in China. I think in most countries, sustainable investing here is also called socially responsible investing, ESG investing, and also green investing. I think maybe some will argue that, green investing is different with ESG investing. But because in China, and I believe in some of the major markets globally, green investing counts for a big chunk in ESG investing. So we see a lot of local industry report and also policy documents. They kind of put ESG investing and green investing together as a form of sustainable investing. So in terms of trend, sustainable investing is definitely on the rise in China. So if we look at the green loans alone, so actually last year we saw a big surge in terms of the outstanding green loans in China last year compared to a year ago. So we are now maybe the world largest green lender. And if we look at the ESG public funds, we can also see that there is like you can see from this picture, we actually saw a huge surge last year compared to previous years. And especially when we look at this particular kind of column, you can see that actually the energy saving and environmental protection industry, or this theme, account for a big chunk in the themes covered by China's public funds. And also, we're huge in terms of green bond. So according to Bloomberg, last year, we have this big, like $59 billion US green bonds issued in China. Just, we're talking about onshore. So which is up by 46 from a year ago and a nearly six-fold increase from 2020. So if we talk about the quarterly data, we can see that issuance has now topped 100 billion yuan for the third straight quarter to now. So yeah, we can see that the surge and also the number is very impressive. Like I said, China's funds bet very big on the green economy. So if we take Morningstar's data, we can see that China overtook the United States as the second largest climate funds market in the world last year. So this chart is provided by JP Morgan. So we can see that if we are talking about the ESG funds, we can see that most funds focus on the E element, the environment element, instead of the other issues. And we're very glad to see that China's ESG funds outperform the global peers. So 2 points here. One point is that actually in general, China's funds, especially mutual funds, are mostly active funds. So the same applies to China's ESG funds. So most China's ESG funds are also active, which is a little bit different compared with some of other major markets globally. And so we can tell from this charts that China's ESG funds are outperforming their global peers in return in the recent years. So if we wonder what drives ESG China's investors to conduct ESG investing, here is the top consideration, that is risk mitigation. So here is a chart which is based on a survey conducted by the China securities regulator. So from this chart, we can see that you either call it the risk reduction or risk mitigation is the top consideration. And if we talk about like driving alpha or so-called excess return, then maybe not that many investors are, thinking that ESG investing can kind of generate, financial alpha for them. Yeah, so if we are talking about impact investing in China, maybe I'll just give you, kind of agreed on definition here in China, which is from Jin, from the Global Impact Investing Network. So when we talk about impact investing, we are talking about those investments made with intention to generate positive and also measurable social and environmental impacts, along with, of course, financial returns. So that is our definition for impact investing in China, which is, we think, part of ESG investing strategies. But impact investing is still at its very early stage in China. I know globally it's also this case, but in China, because of our social and also political kind of context, it is particularly early stage, so to speak. So according to this report, we can see that if we talk about support from government or the public awareness or, the products available in the market, there's still quite a big room to kind of improve. Yeah, so because in China, when we talk about impact investing, a lot of people still think that, especially for the mainstream financial institutions, they think that this is, kind of pretty much like donation, or it only belongs to the philanthropic sectors. So the impact investing, this practice hasn't really been picked up by the mainstream, especially the institutional investors. And also, just like what is happening globally, we still lack for like the disclosure kind of framework or a mechanism, or like the comprehensive rating system. So yeah, I think this part is pretty much similar with the global market. Yeah. But we have good news, so don't be too disappointed. The good news is that I think many people know that China's top leader plans to reach carbon neutrality and also peak carbon by to 2060. So this has become the national strategy that drives a lot of change and also a slate of policies to support this national strategy. And this is definitely a very good news for people in the sustainability world, because it means that money is coming. Like what this particular asset class, which is like when we talk about PE funds, we saw quite a lot of like green PE funds set up last year because of the policy push. So, of course, the numbers are here, the increase is big, and also we saw quite a lot of like major players. They're either like strong, private money, and also, the so-called state player, and also some, veteran investors. They're all coming to kind of bet on the green economy. And besides the investors, we also see some CVCs, or so-called the corporate venture capital. They're also investing heavily in green energy, especially the power generators. Because of all the policies, they actually are feeling a lot of pressure, either from the government and also from the market. So the leading players are actually now investing heavily in renewable energy projects. We know that China now has almost 1/3 of the world's installed renewable capacity of electricity. So with this kind of policy push and also with all those big money, we expect to see that China might lead the renewable energy development globally as well. And also another big theme in terms of national strategy is the so-called rural rejuvenation. This is not only about farms, but all the things relevant to kind of rural development via like industry support, and not just by donation or the, old ways. So we see that if we talk about like the value, and especially if we compare the value here with the previous page, with the green investing, maybe this sounds kind of small, but this has been really a growth compared with last year, and most of the funds with the theme of rural rejuvenation is actually fueled by the state capital. So we can see that actually in recent weeks, we actually have noticed that the state regulator have come up with quite an important guidance to kind of encourage more private capital to kind of investing in this rural rejuvenation kind of thing. So if people wonder what kind of projects can be kind of invested if under this theme, it can be like sustainable agricultural or rural development, or anything that is relevant to rural area, rural kind of development. Yeah, that is a brief introduction of what is happening in China's sustainable investing world. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Yigu.
Thank you, Yigu, for your amazing introduction of China's sustainable development, investment, and impact investing landscape. We are happy to see that sustainable investing is on the rise in China, and China has become a green bond giant, as you mentioned. Now, let's start with our first topic discussion, the trend of sustainable development. Lilian, would you like to tell us more about the global trend of sustainable investment before the COVID-19 pandemic, and how important is it in the post-pandemic era?
Okay. So yes, I think we'll say a bit more about China's situation, but actually some development is quite similar in China compared with the global development. One is that I think the state policies that I just mentioned, like all the green and rural policies in recent years, have actually helped to kind of reshape how the financial institutions determines the so-called materiality of non-financial issues. And because the state regulators have such a strong push for a greener economy, so actually it has made it increasingly a mandate for financial institutions to consider non-financial factor when making investment decisions. I think this is definitely happening both in China and also globally. So in this shift, there's risks and also structural opportunities. But I think maybe for now, especially for most institutional investors, they pay much attention to the risks brought by the climate change instead of the potential opportunities. So, and the second point that I want to bring about, I think also applies to both China and also globally, is that COVID has put more burden on the state and also local government's budget. Because especially in China, China offers free vaccination, all the free tests that we enjoy basically every day now in Beijing, and all the other, anti-COVID measures. So I've noticed actually there are quite a number of local news reporting, local officials saying that they have to kind of move money that is originally under the budget for poverty alleviation to anti-COVID activities. So this has definitely kind of slowed down a bit, in some sectors of sustainable investing because of the COVID pressure for both the government and also all the major market players. And I think the third point might be that if you look at the data in 2020, actually there is a bit kind of slowdown in terms of China's green bond insurance. That was because that some of the money was, like I said, moved to the so-called social bond related to COVID issues. So I think COVID kind of slowed down the development, not only the sustainable investing development, but also the economic development and also job creation, not only in China. I think it definitely applies globally. So how can we have inclusive transition that can be, the green transition can be quite expensive. So how we can balance the challenge with all the inclusion issues, I think that definitely pose challenges to not only governments, but also market players. Yeah, that's my take.
Thanks for putting up with the questions like how to balance the economic development and the COVID and also the sustainable development. Martin, would you like to add some comments or insights on Igor's the introduction above, and how do you see the global trend before the pandemic and how important it is in the post-pandemic era, according to your findings in the US?
Thank you so much, Xiao Chen, and thank you so much for the Columbia Global Center in Beijing for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be joining you this morning. For me here in New York, it's just after 7 a.m. Evening for you in Beijing. So I think I can try to merge my answer or my reaction to Yuhu Lin's very useful presentation, as well as the first question on the trend, the global trend on sustainable investment. And I think it's useful for us to get some definitional issues out of the way in the way I will approach the discussion here today, perhaps a little bit different than what you're usually what you're used to hearing when it comes to ESG investing or impact investing. So I think before the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, there already was a global trend of sustainable investment. It didn't arise with the pandemic, or at least there was a trend in the narrative of investors, of investment funds or financial institutions or business enterprises in the real world in claiming that their investments were sustainable, or in claiming that they were trying to achieve investment that's sustainable. As well as there has been a trend in the narrative and increasingly in the policies and laws of governments that they are also trying to seek to encourage, attract investment for sustainable development. But despite this narrative and these initial steps, there wasn't, and I think there still isn't, a global trend of clarity as to what sustainable investment actually means or should mean in practice. Here at the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment is in our name, and our definition, or the definition that we adopt, is a broader one than ESG, environmental and social and governance investing, or impact investing, or even goes beyond the financial products and solutions that have been created and that have been used so far for these purposes. Our definition is grounded on the real economy, on impact in the economy. So for us, sustainable investment means economic activity that contributes to and does not undermine sustainable development. And elements of sustainable development, which were just mentioned before in the introduction to this webinar, include improving human well-being, reducing economic, social, legal, political inequality, protecting and realizing human rights, protecting the global environment, which includes the global climate system. So in view of our broader definition of what sustainable investment means, to my mind, the pandemic didn't change much. It didn't fundamentally change how important sustainable investment is. Maybe the pandemic did make the need for sustainable investment even more evident, usually, and it was just flagging how it brought pressure under actors to act more sustainably. Maybe the pandemic gave us an opportunity to build back better, as you've probably heard the expression, to build back sustainably, to shape investment in our economies and societies in order to achieve sustainable development for all. But I think making all investments sustainable continues to be just as fundamentally important as it was before the pandemic. At the same time, meaningfully impactful sustainable investment still has a long way to increase to achieve sustainable development goals globally. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Martin and Yigu, for answering this question. Great sharing. And as Martin just mentioned, before the pandemic, there was already a trend of sustainable development investment. But when the pandemic occurs, the pandemic didn't change much. And even before the pandemic, global government has already promoted the sustainable investment, but might not as practical as we expected. So let's move on to our next question, the key actors of sustainable investment. Lilian, as you mentioned in the presentation, more players are participating in sustainable investing, like banks, foundations, PVC or CVC, corporate venture capitals, family office, or high net worth individuals. Are they the key actors of impact investing or sustainable investing? And how do you see the differences between the role of private capital and the state-run capital in promoting sustainable investing? And what responsibilities do they have, and how do they interact with each other?
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Xiaochen. So if we talk about like the most important force in China to drive this market development is definitely the government, because you know that China's financial market is heavily kind of influenced by the government, especially the central government. So if we talk about the most important force, that is definitely the government. But if we're talking about the market players, and if we, first maybe we need to mention about the green bond because it's huge. So we know that most of the green bond issuers in China are industrial firms. And that is followed by the local governments and also utility organizations. And if we talk about the green loans, of course, it's the banks, and especially the major 20-something banks contribute a lot to the green loan market, especially the leading six state-owned banks. They, I think, contribute like half of the green loans. So and besides that, if we talk more about like the value creation, then we might talk about like the impact investors here. Then I think the major players are PEVC and then the CVCs. I think one point that is different from our global peers is that I know that in the States, like the high net worth individuals are like a major kind of player in terms of conducting impact investing. But here we, especially in mainland China, we really haven't seen a surge in number of that group in doing impact investing. I think that is a result of the philanthropic culture and also some social context. So that is kind of different from our global peers. Yeah.
Thanks, Lilian. And how is your opinion, Martin?
Thank you, Xiaoqian. Troubling unmuting here. So I think I can complement Lilian's response here with a few other actors that are not as prominent in impact investing or seen as important in this context. But given my broader definition of what sustainable investment means or should mean, we can think of a few others. I will also start with the government here just to complement. Because the government is responsible for setting the national sustainable development priorities in each country. So it is a key actor in that regard because it will set the laws, the regulations, the policies that will govern both domestic and international investment within their territories. The government will monitor compliance by investors with the legal regime, will ensure that it's enforced. And this regulatory framework, legal and regulatory framework, can cover areas such as public health, safety, access to public infrastructure, environmental protection, labor rights, other human rights. All of it is part of a framework for investment that's conducive to sustainable development. And the government has a key role in being the steward of the actual impact of sustainability in investment. Both governments in the host state of the investment and governments of the home state of when you're talking about foreign investment, because they also have or should have a role in regulating the conduct of their companies when these companies invest abroad. Lilian has talked about financial institutions. I'm not going to stress so much that point, and other financial actors, but there are also domestic as well as foreign investors, business enterprises that are actually realizing the investment itself, that are making the economy function. And they then face an obligation to comply with all these obligations in the host country, including any legal instruments that govern their relationship with other stakeholders. And as a final point, I would like to highlight two key stakeholders that I'm leaving for last, but they should not be left out in any circumstance. Local communities, including indigenous peoples throughout the world, they are affected by investment activities. They get the benefits of investment, right, like jobs and income that is generated and other public benefits that result from government revenues out of the investment, but they also suffer the impacts such as soil pollution, air pollution, the imbalance in our climate system, etc. So as such, they have an interest in how investment takes place and how investment is regulated and how sustainably it's made. And they should also have a say in how investment takes place. But often, and more often than not, they don't have a say, and their needs are not met. First, they're not heard, and their needs are not met. So local communities are a key actor to be considered as well in sustainable investing. And finally, consumers. Consumers beyond the community that's affected by a specific investment project, they have a hidden collective power in how they choose what goods and services they will purchase, and therefore whether their consumption patterns will affect or encourage sustainable or unsustainable investment. And in the activities of sustainable or unsustainable companies or economic activities. At the same time, individual consumers have very little discrete power, each individual consumer, and they have very little information at their fingertips compared to governments and especially compared to companies. And consumers can be and often are misled by company claims and claims by financial institutions, including greenwashing claims. So it's a very key stakeholder group to bear in mind, and that deserves protection as well.
Yeah, I definitely echo with Martin's comments on the role played by the consumers, especially the younger generation. They either play, have the role of consumer, of course, and also we see that the younger generation of investors in those institutional, in those financial institutions, they actually have bigger passion in terms of, at least paying attention to sustainable investing. And maybe, in the future, if they have the chance, if they have the position, they will conduct impact investing or sustainable investing in their own agencies. But for now, we think that's, of course, they're forced to be noticed, but in terms of the real practices by the financial institutions, it's still like the old way. Yeah. And also, definitely the foreign capital is playing a big part in terms of driving the sustainable investing here in China. Because when we ask some of the PE or VCs why they have the interest in paying attention to ESG investing, some of them actually, quite a number of them said they have foreign LPs and they have to, fill the blanks of those questionnaires. So they need to, have relevant practices, either ESG measures within their institution or conduct ESG investing. But I think, to be honest, some of them maybe at this stage only use this as a marketing or fundraising kind of tool instead of really doing the real, ESG investing or impact investing. Yeah.
Thanks for the insightful conversation. And we all know that climate change is real and urgent, and energy transition is focal point to the need for greater sustainability. And there are lots of opportunities that can be found around the world and across market capitalizations. Energy transition is a long-term process, and it may take longer time than traditional capital to exit. So, which makes sustainable investment different from traditional investments. Speaking of the longer holding period of time, what are the interests and the risks for investors in this regard, and how can governments, banks, and companies incentivize investors in this process? And Martin, how do you think?
Thank you, Xiaoqian. So on the various interests and risks and possible incentives that can be set up for investments in the energy transition, let me briefly say, and I will really defer to you, Lynn's more detailed response here, but let me briefly say that colleagues of mine here at the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment are conducting research on the drivers of renewable energy investment. So I just wanted to start off by saying stay tuned for our publication about this topic in the next couple of months. Let me just try to offer a very brief response. When we talk about investment in the energy transition, we're actually talking about a wide range of investments. We're talking about investment in renewable power generation, solar, wind, geothermal, hydropower. We're talking about investment in battery, other energy storage technologies, green hydrogen, electric vehicles, energy efficiency. Of course, we can say they're all energy investments, and they are, of course, but I don't think we can generalize what the interests and risks and possible incentives that can be set up associated with all of them, because these interests, risks, and potential incentives will vary depending on the type of investment, especially designing incentives, which should not be done without a timeline. Incentives should have an end, is a very complex task that will have to look at all the actors and their interests and the risks. So for each investment project, there may be different considerations. But just very generally, I would point to two crucial factors that I see for investment in the energy transition. One is the need to phase out incentives for fossil fuels. Zero carbon energy is already a better competitive alternative to the fossil economy. So we first need to let it flourish. And we can't let it flourish if at the same time we're protecting and subsidizing coal, oil, and gas. We need to fight the lobby by the fossil industry. They will keep trying to hold on to their privileges, but we need to resist that lobby, and we need to allow space for zero carbon energy investment to happen. And the second point is that financial institutions, and I'm sure Lillian will touch on this in greater depth than me, both internationally and domestically, they need to take into account that sustainable climate-aligned investment will pay off in the long term. So they have to increase the availability, the accessibility, and the volume of finance that's available for investment in the energy transition.
Lillian, do you have something to ask?
Well, I'll just, I have nothing to add because Martin's the expert of energy transition.
Okay, great. Martin, do you want to share more about how does international laws and treaties standardize the investment for sustainable investing?
Thank you so much for the question. This is where I really feel like I'm an expert in, and I hope my answer is not too long, so I'll try to keep it short. So the area of international law that touches on investment is called international investment law, and it comprises investment treaties. These treaties, which are agreements between states, offer protection for foreign investments and investors. And they also provide a dispute settlement mechanism called investor-state dispute settlement, or ISDS, investor-state arbitration. It's based on international arbitration. And this mechanism is then used to enforce protections against protections given to foreign investors and enforce them against host states. The problem with investment law, international investment law, as it stands now, is that it doesn't even try to regulate investment. It's a unilateral tool to give protection to foreign investors. And it's increasingly being criticized as constraining the duty and the right of states to regulate public interest areas, including the ones that we've mentioned here: climate policy, public health, human rights, environment, and the pursuit of sustainable development. So there is an important point to be made here that these treaties have been studied empirically, and there's no evidence, there's inconclusive evidence that they can perform on any benefit that they promise. They can't increase the quantity or quality of foreign investment. They can't depoliticize conflicts. They can't promote governance reforms or strengthen the rule of law. So countries set up this regime with certain goals in mind, but the empirical evidence says it's not fit for purpose. much of the regulation of investment can and arguably should be done by domestic legal systems, domestic laws and regulations. So our argument is that states should move away from the existing international regime to ensure that they have domestic policy space to regulate investment. They can move away by terminating treaties or withdrawing from existing investment treaties. And at the same time, they can commit not to negotiate new treaties that will be just as flawed as the current ones in aligning with climate and sustainability objectives. All that said, thinking we should move away from the existing regime, we can also think of a regime that focuses on investment governance and that is in line with climate action and with the sustainable development goals. And we have here at CCSI that this is the bread and butter of our work here. We think a lot about these issues, but I can drop a few here on ideas what international law could look like to support sustainable investment. So, for example, it could create mechanisms and a forum for international cooperation for sustainable investment within and between countries, and including participatory mechanisms to ensure that the voices of those stakeholders that I mentioned earlier that are often not heard, local communities, indigenous populations, to ensure that those voices are heard, especially when they are the most affected and vulnerable. International law could also foster international cooperation, research and development, financing mechanisms for climate-aligned sustainable investment, including in all those areas that I mentioned in the previous answer: energy efficiency, renewable electrification, climate-resilient grids, green hydrogen, battery production, recycling, etc. International law could also cooperate or promote cooperation between states to address challenges in the governance of international energy investment, including intellectual property, challenges, technology transfer. International law could serve as a tool to strengthen the right and duty of states to regulate in the public interest to achieve sustainability and climate goals. International law could support domestic and administrative and judicial systems so that they can facilitate investment regulation and enforcement of that regulation. And I will wrap up here because we have quite a bit more to discuss. Thank you so much.
Great sharing, and thanks. Now let's move on to the question for Lilian. Would you like to share the regulatory efforts in sustainable investing in China? You mentioned about the top regulators push for a low carbon economy and rural rejuvenation. Can you elaborate more on it? And Martin, could you talk more about the efforts in the US or in Europe after Lilian's sharing? Lilian, you can go first.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Xiaochen. So, if we talk about the green investing, I think I have to mention that there are two overarching kind of policy documents released, I think last October, by the State Council, the top regulator in China, to kind of provide the principles and the guidelines for all the works related to carbon neutrality and peak carbon that include the green finance. So after that, all ministries and all levels of governments followed, by more concrete or local plans or policies to kind of respond to that. So this system is called 1+N, numeral others. So that was first brought out by President Xi in a public speech, and then we saw tons of policies and and other kind of government measures to kind of respond to that, support Xi's pledge. So I wouldn't go in details to kind of number all the policies, but I would like to mention a few. One is because we all know that at least now the green bond is huge in China. So we saw the green bonds endorsed project category co-released by the state regulators, which was also updated recently to clarify on some definitions of green loans and also help the issuers to have a better understanding of what kind of projects can get, incentives, and also can be kind of issued as a green bond. Even though I have to point out that there's a kind of disagreement in terms of definition of green bond in China and globally, but we are working on that. But just like Martin mentioned, even though we have the international laws, but different markets, especially, China is such a huge market, and we are very different from our Western peers. So we have to take take into consideration our state development and also our own needs when we come up with all the so-called industry standards, and the green bond is no difference. And if we look at the local city level, we see that Shenzhen actually released a green finances kind of development regulation, which is the first of this kind nationwide from a local government level. And also, if we talk about the financial industry in general, we saw also last year, the PBOC released a disclosure guidance for all the financial institutions to kind of disclose their environmental related information, which was also, I think, the first of this kind, nationwide in terms of green finance. And I think just days ago, there were also more concrete plans targeting at the banking and also insurance industry to guide them to conduct more green finance, basically just to attract more money to boost this country's green economy more efficiently. Yeah, so this is the green economy side. If we talk about the rural rejuvenation, we now actually have a national law to promote rural rejuvenation. So the rest is history. Of course, there are tons of policies and government measures to support that. And also, like I said, weeks ago, we saw a guidance to kind of promote more private capital to invest in the rural rejuvenation theme, because this really takes patience. I mean, this thing really asks for patient capital, and the investors with a kind of long-term value creation kind of horizon. Only those investors can really come in and help with the country's rural rejuvenation by investing their money. Yeah.
Martin, how do you think?
Thank you. So for me, I will talk a little bit about very similar regulatory activity to what Lillian was just telling us about. That's also happening in the European Union and the United States. So starting with the European Union, there's quite a bit, and I'll throw a few acronyms at you. You can read about it in greater detail later. In 2014, the European Union adopted the Non-Financial Reporting Directive, or NFRD, which lays down rules on disclosure of non-financial information, including how companies navigate social and environmental challenges. And later on, 2017, the EU approved accompanying guidelines to that directive. So in 2017, voluntary guidelines were adopted to help companies disclose social and environmental information. And in 2019, the EU adopted also accompanying guidelines on corporate disclosure of climate-related information. These 2019 ones provide guidance for companies on how they will report on the impacts of their business on the climate and on how the impacts of climate change affect their business, both ways. So just to show that this is a pre-pandemic trend, but regulation was already being adopted. And in April this year, the European Commission also adopted a broader proposal for a corporate sustainability reporting directive that's yet to be approved, and that would have wider applicability than the current one. There's also the EU Taxonomy for Sustainable Economic Activities. It's been in force since July 2020, and the goal here is to create an EU-wide common classification system that includes a list of economic or environmentally sustainable economic activities. The goal is of this list and of this taxonomy is to create a common language and a definition of what actually means sustainability within Europe. Another recent regulation that came into effect in March 2021 is the Sustainable Finance Disclosures Regulation. It sets obligations on manufacturers of financial products and financial advisors, how they behave, how they advise their end investors. Now, coming to the US, there's very recent movement this year by the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC. In March this year, the SEC proposed rules on mandatory climate-related disclosures by companies. And these rules include, or the disclosures that they cover include information about climate-related risks that impact their business, results, or operations, certain climate-related financial statement metrics, as well as companies' greenhouse gas emissions. So all of this would be covered by these proposed rules, which are still in debate period. And just very recently, May 25th, the SEC proposed 2 more rules that would prevent misleading or deceptive claims by US funds on their ESG qualifications to increase disclosure requirements for those funds. The purpose of those regulations then is to avoid greenwashing, avoid having companies claim that they are sustainable or SDG aligned or climate aligned or ESG aligned when they're actually not. And these proposals recently issued by the SEC respond to concerns about greenwashing in the US by funds that are trying to profit from the current trend, the current rise in ESG investment, and advertising their funds as sustainable when there are concerns that they might actually not be sustainable.
Yeah, if I can add, because Martin just mentioned several times about the greenwashing, and actually this, the topic of greenwashing also triggers a lot of debates or discussions here in China, because a lot of people, especially like people from outside China, think that many of China's green bonds cannot be called green bond because it is not up to international standards. But for us, actually, for example, I know that also you mentioned the EU taxonomy. So I know that some, let's say, international organizations have also kind of come up with the China version kind of taxonomy of sustainable investing for Chinese investors. And the feedbacks that I got from some of the investors, especially institutional investors, is that, let's just put it this way, this is too much for them because they haven't, come to the stage to kind of clarify all those issues, because we're still in an intensive kind of learning stage or process of getting all the green finance things going. So yes, for us, we are kind of trying to balance. On the one hand, we want to avoid greenwash, of course. But on the other hand, if we put too much kind of a restriction or expect too high on the market, maybe it will kind of make the market small before we have a very sound development of sustainable investing and also sustainable market in China. So there's kind of a line to walk between these two kind of extremes. Yeah, that's what I want to add. Thank you.
Thanks, Lilian. Thanks, Martin. And due to the time limitation, we need to move on to the next question. ESG factor, as you mentioned, Lilian, is incorporated in the consideration of risk mitigation for investors. Can you share how the investors incorporate these factors into investment analysis?
Mm-hmm. I think there's no single agreed-on way to do so. So usually it starts with, just like any other financial analysis, it starts with qualitative and also quantitative analysis of the targeted company, like including the industry the company is in, the company's strategy. And so usually the ESG integration looks at both the risks and also opportunities revealed by the 3 elements, the E, S, and G, that are again, material for a company or market. And then you can build like valuation models and proceed, portfolio construction based on all the relevant information from the relevant analysis. So with all the analysis, you can make, investment decisions on whether you want to kind of hold or increase, maintain, or decrease the weighting of the targeted company in your portfolio. And if you are still an investor or a major investor of the company, you can try to kind of improve or affect the company's ESG performance in ways like cooperative engagement or proxy voting, etc. Yeah. So, but there's no like I said, there's no one single agreed upon way. We actually saw a lot of best practices and also got detailed guidances from the industry associations like PRI and the likes. So for people who are interested in this, they can have tons of reports to read or put this as their night desk.
Great. If any of our audiences are interested in this topic, please do check out the website to look for more reports in this topic. And when investors are thinking about climate change risk, Lilian, according to your findings, is there any useful framework that can help us simplify this topic for capital allocators?
Mm-hmm. So if we look outside the country, I think Martin also mentioned there are a lot of alphabets for us to remember. And I think in terms of framework, they're definitely so-called alphabet soup in the international market. So if we look outside, there's also a couple of major kind of frameworks for us to do so. But if we look domestically, I think besides the disclosure issue, like I mentioned, PBOC had a guidance already released for all the financial institutions to kind of refer to, and also for the major institutional investors like banks and insurance companies to also have their regulators to have issued relevant guidance for them. But if we talk about tools, and also a metrics, I don't think that we have come to a unified kind of framework for everyone, for all kinds of investors to use. I think we still have a lot of process to make. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you so much for Lilian and Martin's insightful conversation. We hope that our audiences could get more inspiration for things you can do to accelerate investment for sustainable development. We are close to the end of our time together. In the last session of this panel, we will open up the floor to questions. If our audiences have any questions, could you please raise your hand and ask questions or type your questions into the box. Let me check if there is any other question. There is one question coming from Siqi. How is the energy crisis triggered by the war in Ukraine affecting the prospects of sustainable investing?
Do you want to take this one first, Martin?
I can take this one first. Thank you so much, Siqi. And it's, of course, a very complex question for us to try to address. The current war of aggression in Ukraine is, of course, a global shock in the energy regime and the energy system that affects beyond Ukraine, of course, affects beyond the borders of the country that's being invaded. And we've experienced shocks. It's difficult to talk about this, not focusing on the human element, but on the economic element. But let's just agree that the human element is egregious, and there's no place for war in our current in our world nowadays. But then moving on to talking about economic implications, I would say that we have experienced shocks earlier. This is one of them. It's hopefully not going to drag much further along. It has already been too long for a war that should never have happened. But what I want to say is that this current shock doesn't affect the underlying economics of the energy market. This current shock will not make coal, oil, and gas better investments in the long term. They will continue to be the worst alternatives to renewable energy investment. So it's a short-term shock. That's the main message here. But in the long term, it will not change the patterns of investment in renewable energy, in storage, in green hydrogen, etc. All the investments associated with the energy transition. First, because these investments are more competitive already when we stop subsidizing fossil fuels. And second, because there's an environmental imperative and really a humanity survival imperative that we have to tackle here. We do have to move away from fossil fuels to be able to stabilize greenhouse gas emissions in a way that can prevent catastrophic climate change. So we have both an economic rationale to move away and a moral and environmental imperative to move away from fossil fuels and to continue on the trend of the energy transition. So that's hopefully a useful question, and maybe Lillian can complement. Thank you.
Yeah, I definitely agree on Martin's point that it won't affect the fossil fuel industry. People trying to move away from fossil fuel industry or try to kind of improve this sector's ESG performance in the long term. But I think maybe in the short term, we saw some not that encouraging kind of things happening. You see the stock price of all those fossil fuel companies. They have that disturbing surge recently. So so in the short term, for those people who may just de-invest from fossil fuel companies, they might become hesitate or kind of influenced negatively by this war, and also by how the war has affected the fossil fuel industry. But in the long run, I definitely agree with Martin that it won't affect the general trend, that more and more investors will, prefer or choose to do sustainable investing. And also another point, actually another discussion I saw recently because of the war is that I saw some people say that, okay, everyone know that defense sector is kind of definitely, in the usually, negatively screened by ESG or sustainable investors. But people ask that, what about those defense companies which produce like weapons to help Ukraine to protect itself? So will ESG investors choose to invest in those companies or not, or still keep them in the blacklist? So yeah, this is, I think, is some interesting discussion for us to kind of, think for this moment. Yeah, I think that's just interesting, but definitely in the long term, it won't affect the general trend. Yeah.
I saw one more question from the audience, which is how to tap the market potential of developing countries and involve them in international cooperation on sustainable development investment. Lillian or Martin, would you like to answer this question? How to tap the market potential of developing countries and involve them in international cooperation on sustainable investing?
I'm happy to take this one briefly, Lillian, unless you want to go first.
Sure.
So I think this goes to my answer earlier to how international law should shape international investment flows. And I think the way to cooperate with developing countries, and I assume here you mean developed countries and capital exporting states, emerging economies that are still considered developing economies, but that have much more well-developed economies now and that are investing abroad in areas of the world that have not reached yet the same level of development. How to establish the cooperation between those countries. First, as I highlighted, I think we need to move away from the existing regime that doesn't work for sustainable development in developing countries, and then actually build a regime that will work for that type of investment, based on true international cooperation and listening to the needs and the interests of these developing countries. What do countries who ultimately will set their national development priorities, what do they want out of foreign investment? How do they see sustainability? What are their priorities in terms of generating income, in terms of leveraging potential from certain natural resources or their internal markets? What are their priorities in terms of generating, creating jobs, protecting the environment, and using economic activity to leverage all those elements of sustainable development and bring the benefits that each country needs. So without a dialogue that listens to these countries' needs, this cooperation cannot happen. And this dialogue, in my view, is not yet happening in the current international investment law regime, which, as I briefly explained to you, is really only about protecting economic interests of foreign investors. These treaties are not about promoting sustainable development in the host countries of the investment. So we really need a reshifting of the whole paradigm to be able to address sustainability in developing countries.
Thanks, Martin. And one more question for Yigu. Is there a chance anymore for US and China to cooperate in the area? If so, what might be the easiest to reach a consensus and collaboration?
Thank you, Xiaozhen, and thank you for the audience who raised this question. And I think maybe this topic is the only chance that we will see any US-China cooperation. Where else? I mean, like the climate change is like a global topic. This is shared universally, not only in China, the US, and also in other markets. So I think that definitely we will, China and the US will reach some kind of agreement. But what kind of agreement and when, let's see, because compared with the US, actually China has cooperated a lot with the EU market, the EU regulators, especially the UK, because EU is definitely advanced or leading this transition. So we're actually cooperating a lot with the EU. And compared with EU, let's just say that the US is kind of conservative in this transition. So we are, like Martin just mentioned about the SEC's recent move. So we actually also pay a lot of attention to SEC's next move to see if it can be more kind of, advanced in terms of coming up with more concrete policies or measures. And I think until everything is clearer, then we can maybe come up with a timeline to kind of forecast the potential cooperation between China and the US. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Lilian. And due to time limitation, we will pick the final question, which is, how do you view the difference among ESG ratings and the impact of too many rating standards, which might confuse both enterprises and investors? From Yuexuan.
I think we're still in this journey of integrating all those alphabets, in this alphabet soup. So that I think globally we see a lot of we already noticed the kind of trend of integrating or converging of all those different ratings, all those different impact management and measurement tools, frameworks, metrics, etc. So the trend is definitely happening. All the merge, especially when we look at the founding of ISSB. The reason that this new kind of platform was founded was to kind of integrate all the existing kind of tools or frameworks or different standards and come up with one that is equivalent with the existing financial standard, which is relatively more widely used and also widely agreed upon. So I think we're in this trend globally to kind of see this merge. And for China, because we're still at the early stage of picking up with ESG concepts and all the relevant practices. So we're actually learning by doing. We are in the intensive learning process of getting all the ESG things from our international peers to learn from them, to learn from their best practices. And we are also, we see that in the local markets, there are actually some local or domestic rating agencies coming up or catching up with the international players, even though we still notice the gap in terms of methodology, in terms of the quality of data, etc. But I think that, it takes time to kind of catch up, takes time to kind of integrate everything. So yeah, I think it's still an issue of process or it's a journey. Yeah.